She will come, Daniel said with a smug smile as he adjusted his tuxedo in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror inside the bridal suite. After everything, she still will not be able to stay away. His best man laughed. You really sent her an invitation? Daniel shrugged. Why not? Everyone deserves closure. But the look in his eyes told a different story. He had invited me for one reason only. He wanted an audience for my humiliation. Outside, the ballroom at Ocean Crest Resort sparkled under crystal chandeliers and white roses. More than 200 guests filled the room. Investors, friends, family, people who had watched our marriage fall apart, people who believed every cruel thing he had said about me. I heard the whispers before I even stepped inside. That is her, the ex-wife, the one who could not have children. Why would she come? I tightened my fingers around the small hands holding mine. 3 tiny hands squeezed back. Calm, trusting, safe. The luxury car came to a stop beneath the covered entrance. The driver stepped out first. Then the rear door opened. Silence spread across the crowd like a wave. One little boy climbed out. Then another. Then a third. Matching navy jackets. Matching curls. Matching bright smiles. Gasps rippled through the guests standing near the entrance. A woman lowered her champagne glass. Someone else pulled out a phone. I stepped onto the stone driveway behind them, lifting my chin as every eye turned toward me. 3 years ago, I had walked away from my marriage carrying nothing but a suitcase and the pieces of a broken heart. Today, I walked forward with my head high. Daniel had expected me to arrive alone. That mistake would cost him everything. He still thought I was the woman he had left behind. The woman he called broken. The woman he called a failure. The woman he called barren. He had no idea how wrong he was. Inside the ballroom, the music slowed to a stop. Conversations faded. Even the wedding planner froze with her clipboard in hand. I felt hundreds of eyes moving between me and the 3 boys beside me. They were searching for answers. They would not get them today. Not yet. Daniel turned toward the entrance, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. Then he saw me. His confident smile returned for a moment. The same smile he wore the day he told me I was holding him back. The same smile he wore when he said he deserved a real family. For 7 years, I stood beside him while he built his business. I celebrated every success. I carried every disappointment. When he doubted himself, I reminded him who he was. But when our dream of having children did not happen as quickly as he wanted, everything changed. He stopped looking at me with love. He started looking at me with blame. I spent years apologizing for a problem I did not understand. Years believing I was not enough. Years shrinking myself to fit inside his disappointment. And when he finally walked away, he made sure everyone knew why. I was the woman who could not give him an heir. That label followed me long after our divorce papers were signed. It followed me into grocery stores, into church, into every awkward conversation with people who thought they knew my story. But stories have a way of changing when the truth finally catches up. Daniel straightened his jacket and walked toward me with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. The guests parted for him. He glanced at the boys beside me, amused at first, curious for only a second. Then his expression shifted, just slightly. One of the boys looked up at him and smiled. Daniel stopped walking. His eyes locked onto the small crescent-shaped dimple in the boy's left cheek. The same dimple every man in his family had carried for generations. The color drained from his face. And for the first time that day, my ex-husband looked unsure of himself. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on that tiny dimple for one long, silent second. Then the music started again. Someone laughed nervously. A server hurried past with a tray of champagne. The moment broke before it could become anything more. Daniel straightened his shoulders and forced a smile back onto his face. Whatever he thought he saw, he buried it immediately. Men like him always did. They ignored the truth when it threatened the story they wanted to believe. He still thought he was in control. He still thought this was his day. He had no idea that every step bringing me back into his life had started years before either of us realized it. There was a time when Daniel Whitmore was not the man standing beneath crystal chandeliers in a custom tuxedo. When we met, he rented a tiny apartment above a hardware store in Charleston. His real estate business was nothing more than a folding table, a second-hand laptop, and a dream too big for his bank account. I was the one who believed in him when nobody else did. I worked long hours as a school counselor and spent my evenings helping him organize paperwork, answer emails, and prepare presentations for investors who rarely called back. We lived on takeout dinners and cheap coffee. Some months, we barely covered rent. But we laughed often back then. We made promises on late-night walks along the harbor. We talked about the house we would one day buy, the children we would one day raise. Daniel used to take my hands in his and tell me that no matter how successful he became, I would always be the best thing that ever happened to him. I believed every word. When his first project failed, I sold jewelry my grandmother had left me to help him pay off debt. When his truck broke down, I drove him to meetings before work. When he wanted to quit, I reminded him who he was. I never kept score because that is what love does. It gives without counting the cost. Then everything changed. One investor said yes. One deal turned into two. Two became 10. Suddenly, Daniel was everywhere. Magazine interviews, industry events, charity galas. The little apartment became a downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows. The old pickup truck became a luxury SUV. The man who once apologized for working late stopped apologizing at all. Success did not change his dreams. It changed the people he wanted around him. At first, the changes were small. Missed dinners, unanswered texts, business trips that lasted longer than planned. Then came the comments. Casual at first, easy to ignore. You should buy something nicer to wear. You do not really fit in at these events. Try not to talk too much around my investors. Every time he said something hurtful, he followed it with a smile and told me I was being too sensitive. So I convinced myself he was stressed. I convinced myself things would get better. I kept giving, kept supporting, kept believing in the man I married instead of accepting the man he was becoming. By the time Daniel bought the oceanfront house he had always dreamed about, I had become invisible inside it. His business partners knew his assistant's name better than they knew mine. At parties, people asked what I did while looking over my shoulder for someone more important. Daniel never noticed. Or maybe he did. Maybe he just stopped caring. Looking back now, I can see the exact moment everything shifted. It was not when he made his first $1 million. It was not when we moved into the bigger house. It was the first Thanksgiving after his company hit national headlines. His family gathered around the long dining table, talking about expansion plans and investment opportunities. I sat beside him, proud of everything we had built together. Then his mother set down her fork and smiled at me across the table. Daniel has his legacy now, she said. The business is thriving. The only thing missing is an heir. The room fell quiet. Daniel did not say a word. And for the first time in our marriage, I realized I was sitting alone. After that Thanksgiving dinner, the question followed me everywhere. At first, it came wrapped in concern. Daniel's mother would call every Sunday afternoon and ask if we had any news. His aunt sent articles about fertility diets and miracle supplements. His friends' wives recommended specialists I had never heard of. I smiled politely through all of it because I believed they meant well. I believed that if I just stayed patient, things would get better. But they did not. The questions became assumptions. The assumptions became accusations. Every holiday gathering felt like an interrogation. Every anniversary came with the same painful reminder that another year had passed without the family everyone expected us to have. I suggested we see a doctor together. Daniel agreed at first, but every appointment seemed to conflict with an important meeting or a business trip. Next month, he would say, things are crazy right now. Next month never came. I carried the burden alone because I thought that was what supportive wives did. I tracked ovulation schedules. I changed my diet. I read books late into the night. I blamed myself for every disappointment. Meanwhile, Daniel became more distant. His company kept growing. So did his ego. At business dinners, He introduced me less as his wife and more as an accessory to his success. He laughed louder with investors than he did with me. He spent more time checking stock reports than asking how I felt. One evening, after a charity gala downtown, I overheard two women whispering near the valet stand. "That is Daniel Whitmore's wife." "Really?" "I heard she cannot have children." "What a shame. A man like him needs someone who can continue his legacy." I stood a few feet away, pretending not to hear them. Daniel heard every word. He simply handed the valet his ticket and opened the passenger door for me without saying anything. The silence hurt more than the gossip. It told me he agreed. As months turned into years, that silence became permission. His family stopped treating me like a daughter-in-law and started treating me like an obstacle. At birthday parties and holiday dinners, conversations stopped when I entered the room. His mother no longer asked how I was doing. She asked whether I had scheduled another appointment. His brother once joked that Daniel needed a backup plan. Everyone laughed except me, Daniel included. Every time I tried to explain how deeply those comments wounded me, he accused me of being dramatic. "They are just worried about the future," he said one night as he loosened his tie after work. "You cannot blame them for wanting a family name to continue." I looked at him across our kitchen island, fighting back tears. "What about what I want? What about how I feel?" He sighed as if I were asking too much. "This is not just about feelings, Ava. It is about reality." Reality. That word became his favorite weapon. The reality was that investors trusted family men. The reality was that his parents wanted grandchildren. The reality was that every successful man he knew had children. And slowly, Daniel began speaking as if our struggles belonged only to me. Not us. Me. I noticed it in the way he talked to friends. In the way he answered questions at parties. In the way he avoided conversations about seeing a doctor himself. Whenever I suggested we face this together, his expression hardened. "There is no reason for me to get tested," he said once, barely looking up from his phone. "Everyone knows the problem is not on my side." I remember staring at him, stunned by how certain he sounded. Not because he knew something, because he had already decided what he wanted to believe. And once Daniel believed something, he treated it like fact. The final blow came at the annual holiday party his company hosted at our oceanfront home. More than 100 guests filled the backyard beneath strings of lights overlooking the water. Business partners, clients, friends, families with children running across the lawn. I spent hours helping organize the event, making sure everything was perfect. Near the end of the night, one of Daniel's investors raised a glass and joked, "You have built an incredible company, Daniel. Now all you need is a little air to take over one day." Laughter rippled through the crowd. I forced a smile and looked toward my husband, waiting for him to change the subject. Instead, he wrapped an arm around my shoulders and gave a tight smile that never reached his eyes. "Some things are just not meant to be," he said lightly. Then he looked directly at me. "Not everyone can give you a family." The laughter stopped. A few people glanced away awkwardly. Others looked at me with pity. And in that moment, surrounded by people who had celebrated our success, I realized Daniel was no longer protecting me from their judgment. He was leading it. After that holiday party, something inside me changed. Not all at once. It was slower than that. Like watching a crack spread across glass. Every cruel comment, every unanswered question, every moment Daniel chose silence over kindness widened the distance between us until there was nothing left to save. We stopped eating dinner together. We stopped talking about the future. We stopped pretending we were happy. He stayed later at the office. I spent more time alone in a house that never felt like home anymore. The oceanfront view that once made me feel proud only reminded me how small I had become inside my own life. I kept hoping he would come back to me. I kept believing the man I married was still there somewhere beneath the expensive suits and endless meetings. Then one rainy Thursday evening, Daniel walked into the kitchen carrying a thin white envelope. He placed it on the marble counter between us without looking me in the eye. I knew what it was before I touched it. Divorce papers. 7 years together reduced to a stack of legal documents. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. There was no anger in his voice when he finally spoke. That almost made it worse. "This isn't working anymore, Ava." I looked up at him, searching for some sign of regret. There was none. "You are giving up on us?" I asked quietly. He exhaled as though he had been waiting for this conversation for months. "I want a family. I cannot keep waiting for something that may never happen." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they surprised me, because they confirmed everything I had feared. I was no longer his partner. I was his disappointment. "We could still get answers," I whispered. "We could see a specialist together. We never really tried." His jaw tightened. "There is nothing else to discuss." That was the moment I realized he had already rewritten our story in his mind. In his version, he had done everything right. I was the reason our marriage failed. I was the obstacle standing between him and the future he wanted. He did not just want to leave me. He needed to believe I deserved to be left. The divorce moved quickly. His attorneys handled everything. Friends who used to invite us to dinner stopped calling. His family disappeared completely. Even people who barely knew me looked at me with pity. Word traveled fast in Charleston. Everyone seemed to know why Daniel Whitmore was leaving his wife. Nobody asked for my side of the story. When I packed my belongings, I realized how little of myself remained in that house. A few boxes of clothes. Family photos I could not bear to leave behind. The framed certificate from my counseling degree. I loaded everything into my old sedan, while movers carried away furniture I had helped choose years earlier. Daniel stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. He did not offer to help. He did not ask if I would be okay. He simply watched me leave. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town. The first night there, I sat on the floor surrounded by unopened boxes because I could not afford a couch yet. The silence felt unbearable. For years, I had measured my worth through Daniel's approval. Without him, I no longer knew who I was. I avoided grocery stores near our old neighborhood. I stopped attending church because I could not handle the sympathetic looks. I ignored phone calls from people who only wanted gossip disguised as concern. Some mornings, I could barely get out of bed. Other mornings, I convinced myself Daniel had been right all along. Maybe I really had failed him. Maybe I had failed myself. But one memory refused to leave me alone. Every time I begged Daniel to see a doctor with me, he found an excuse. Every single time. At first, I blamed his schedule. Then I blamed my own impatience. Now, sitting alone in that tiny apartment with nothing left to lose, I began to wonder why he had been so determined to avoid the one thing that could have given us answers. A week after the divorce was finalized, I found an old folder while unpacking a box from our bathroom cabinet. Inside were appointment cards from fertility clinics I had scheduled over the years. Most had my name written on them. One had both our names printed across the top. The appointment had been canceled the day before it was supposed to happen. I stared at the card for a long time. I did not remember canceling it. And suddenly, for the first time in years, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt doubt. The next morning, I picked up my phone and scheduled an appointment Daniel had spent years avoiding. The clinic waiting room smelled like coffee and disinfectant. I sat alone beneath a muted television screen, turning the old appointment card over and over in my hands while doubt battled with fear inside me. Part of me wanted answers. Another part was terrified of hearing the same words that had haunted me for years. When the nurse finally called my name, my legs felt unsteady. I had spent so long believing something was wrong with me that I no longer knew who I would be without that burden. The appointment lasted less than an hour. Years of guilt, years of shame, years of wondering why I had failed as a wife. Reduced to a few questions, a review of my medical history, and tests I should have taken long ago. The doctor was kind but direct. She listened carefully as I explained everything. The years of trying, the canceled appointments, Daniel's refusal to participate, the divorce, the label that followed me everywhere. She frowned when I told her we had never completed a full evaluation as a couple. Fertility challenges are not one person's responsibility, she said gently. They require answers from both partners. I lowered my eyes. Nobody had ever said that to me before. Not my family. Not Daniel's family. Not Daniel himself. For years, everyone had acted as if the outcome was already decided. As if my guilt were a fact instead of an assumption. A week later, I returned for my follow-up appointment. I barely slept the night before. I kept preparing myself for disappointment because disappointment was all I knew. The doctor walked into the room holding a folder and smiled. It was a small smile. Calm. Reassuring. The kind of smile that changes lives. "Ava," she said, taking a seat across from me. "There is nothing in your results that explains why you would be unable to have children." I stared at her, unable to speak. She continued carefully, choosing her words with kindness. "Based on everything we know right now, there is no evidence that you are the problem." The problem. I hated that word. But hearing it lifted from my shoulders felt like breathing fresh air after years underwater. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I cried for the woman who blamed herself every month. For the wife who apologized for things she could not control. For the version of me who believed she was broken because the people she loved told her she was. The doctor handed me a tissue. "I cannot tell you why you struggled in the past without a complete evaluation," she said. "But I can tell you this. You deserve the truth." The truth. It was the one thing Daniel never wanted. As I walked back to my car, I replayed every conversation we had ever had. Every appointment he canceled. Every excuse. Every time he dismissed my concerns. Every time he refused to get tested himself. I had always interpreted his avoidance as fear. Now it felt like something else. I opened the old folder again that evening and spread every appointment card, insurance statement, and medical note across my kitchen table. That was when I found something I had missed before. Tucked between old paperwork was a confirmation email for the canceled appointment with both our names listed. The cancellation request had been submitted online from Daniel's account. I stared at the timestamp. It had been canceled less than 12 hours before we were supposed to go together. He told me the clinic had rescheduled because of a conflict. He lied. I read the email 3 times, hoping I had misunderstood. I had not. For years, I blamed myself for answers we never received because someone made sure we never asked the questions. I did not know why Daniel canceled that appointment. I did not know what he was afraid of. But for the first time since our divorce, I stopped wondering what was wrong with me and started wondering what he had been hiding. 2 days later, while scrolling through social media during my lunch break, I saw a professionally photographed announcement posted by Daniel's company page. He stood beside a blonde woman in a white dress, smiling for the camera with his arm wrapped around her waist. The caption read, "Congratulations to Daniel Whitmore and his fiancée on their engagement." The comments flooded with heart emojis and messages about the beautiful family they would build together. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I noticed the date beneath the announcement. They had gotten engaged only 4 months after our divorce was finalized. Seeing Daniel's engagement announcement felt like losing him all over again. But this time something inside me refused to break. I stared at the smiling photos for a long time, searching for signs that I had imagined our entire marriage. For months, 4 months after our divorce, he was already planning a future with someone else. For days, I replayed every memory in my head, wondering how long he had been moving on while I was still fighting to save us. I wanted answers, but more than that, I wanted peace. I closed the app, set my phone face down on the kitchen table, and made myself a promise. I would stop looking for my worth in the man who had spent years convincing me I had none. It sounded simple. It was not. Healing is expensive, not just emotionally, but financially too. My apartment was small enough that I could touch both kitchen counters without taking a step. I worked full-time at the school and picked up extra hours counseling students after class whenever I could. I learned to budget every dollar. I skipped dinners out. I sold designer handbags I had once carried to Daniel's business events because they reminded me of a life that no longer belonged to me. Some nights, I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by bills, wondering how I had gone from living in an oceanfront home to worrying about grocery prices. The hardest part was not the money. It was the silence. I had spent years organizing my life around someone else's needs. Without Daniel, I had no idea what I enjoyed anymore. Weekends stretched endlessly. Holidays felt unbearable. I avoided places we used to go together because I could not stand the possibility of running into people who knew our story. At work, I smiled for my students even when I wanted to cry in the parking lot afterward. There were days when grief hit me without warning. A song on the radio, a couple holding hands at the grocery store, a child laughing in the school hallway. Every reminder reopened a wound I thought was healing. But slowly, almost without realizing it, I began creating a life that belonged only to me. I started taking evening walks along the waterfront after work. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during my marriage. I returned to church, even though I still felt the weight of curious glances. Every small step felt impossible at first. Then it became easier. One afternoon, the principal at my school called me into her office. I worried I had done something wrong, but she smiled as soon as I sat down. She told me a local nonprofit organization needed someone to lead a new mentorship program for teenagers dealing with family challenges and emotional stress. She said several parents had specifically mentioned my name. "You have a gift for helping people feel seen," she told me. I almost laughed at the irony. For years, I had felt invisible in my own marriage. The position came with extra hours, additional pay, and opportunities to work with community leaders across the city. It was not life-changing money, but it was enough to help me breathe a little easier. More importantly, it reminded me that I still had something valuable to offer the world. I accepted immediately. For the first time since my divorce, I felt hopeful about my future instead of afraid of it. The work was challenging, but it gave me purpose. Every student I helped rebuild their confidence helped me rebuild my own. Little by little, the woman I used to be started returning. Not the woman Daniel wanted me to become. The woman I had been before I learned to doubt myself. One evening, after finishing a community event for the mentorship program, I stayed behind to stack chairs and collect paperwork. Most people had already left. I was carrying a heavy box of donated school supplies toward my car when it slipped from my hands. Folders scattered across the sidewalk. Markers rolled in every direction. Before I could bend down, someone reached for the nearest folder. "Looks like you could use some help," a calm voice said. I looked up and found myself staring into the kindest eyes I had seen in years. The man crouched beside me and gathered the scattered folders before I could answer. He moved carefully, making sure none of the papers blew into the parking lot as the evening breeze picked up. "I think these belong to you," he said, handing me the last folder with an easy smile. His name was Ethan Brooks. He served on the board of the nonprofit that funded our mentorship program and had stayed late to help clean up after the event. He was nothing like the people I had met through Daniel's business world. He did not glance at my clothes to judge my status. He did not ask who I knew or what neighborhood I lived in. Instead, he asked about the students in the program. He wanted to know their stories. He listened when I spoke. Really listened. At first, I kept my distance. After everything I had been through, kindness felt unfamiliar. I had spent years earning love that should have been given freely. I did not know what to do with someone who offered it without conditions. But Ethan never pushed. He showed up consistently. When our program needed extra funding, he found sponsors. When volunteers canceled at the last minute, he stepped in himself. When I doubted whether I was making a difference, he reminded me of the students whose lives had changed because I refused to give up on them. Slowly, I stopped waiting for him to disappoint me. Months passed, and my life began to look different. Not overnight. Not magically. The pain did not disappear, but it stopped controlling every decision I made. I moved into a larger apartment closer to the school. I painted the walls warm colors instead of leaving them bare like my old place. I started hosting small dinners for friends instead of hiding at home on weekends. The mentorship program expanded faster than anyone expected, and I was promoted to oversee multiple locations across the county. Local newspapers featured stories about our work. Parents stopped me in grocery stores to thank me for helping their children. For the first time in years, People recognized me for something other than my marriage. They knew my name because of who I was, not because of who I used to be married to. Every small success rebuilt a piece of the confidence I thought I had lost forever. There were still difficult days. Some nights, I caught myself replaying old conversations with Daniel and wondering how different my life might have been if he had chosen compassion instead of blame. But those moments grew less frequent. The woman staring back at me in the mirror no longer looked defeated. She looked stronger, wiser, free. Ethan noticed the changes before I did. One afternoon, after a community fundraiser, he handed me a framed photo of our mentorship team standing together outside the center. "You built this," he said simply. I started to argue, but he shook his head. "No, Ava. You carried people when they needed someone to believe in them. That matters." His words stayed with me because they were so different from the things I used to hear. Daniel measured my worth by what I could give him. Ethan saw value in who I already was. That difference changed everything. A year after we met, I realized something unexpected. I trusted him, not because he promised me forever, not because he rescued me from my pain, but because he showed up every day and proved that love does not have to be earned through suffering. It can be patient. It can be kind. It can feel safe. One Saturday morning, I was organizing paperwork at home when I heard a knock at my door. A courier stood outside holding a large ivory envelope embossed with gold lettering. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. Some memories never lose their power. I thanked him, closed the door, and stared at the envelope for several seconds before breaking the seal. Inside was a formal invitation printed on thick cream-colored paper. "Daniel Whitmore and Olivia Reynolds request the pleasure of your presence at their wedding celebration." A handwritten note was tucked beneath it. I recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. "I hope you can come. It would mean a lot to finally put the past behind us." I read the note twice, but I already knew the truth. Daniel had never done anything without a reason. And whatever that reason was, it had nothing to do with closure. For a long time, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the invitation in my hands. The heavy cream paper, the gold lettering, the carefully chosen words. Everything about it felt expensive, calculated. Daniel had always understood the power of appearances. He knew exactly how to create a moment people would remember. And he knew exactly how to use an audience. Ethan found me there an hour later, the invitation still open in front of me. He read my expression before I said a word. "What happened?" he asked gently. I slid the card across the table. His eyes moved over the names, then the handwritten note tucked inside. He did not look angry. He looked concerned. "Do you think he really wants closure?" he asked. I let out a quiet laugh. Daniel never cared about closure. He cares about winning. Ethan nodded slowly. He had heard enough stories about my marriage to understand what that meant. Daniel built his life around image, status, and control. Inviting me to his wedding was not an act of kindness. It was a performance. He wanted everyone to see the woman he had left behind, the woman he blamed for everything, the woman he believed had failed him, and he wanted them to compare her to the future he thought he had built without me. I should have thrown the invitation away. Part of me wanted to, but another part remembered every whispered comment, every pitying look, every room where I was treated like a disappointment instead of a person. I knew exactly what Daniel expected. He expected me to stay home because I was embarrassed, or show up alone and broken so he could prove to himself that leaving me had been the right decision. What he did not understand was that I had spent years rebuilding a life he could no longer imagine. Over the next few days, the invitation followed me everywhere. I tucked it into my purse, then moved it to my desk drawer at work, but I could not stop thinking about it. Friends from the mentorship program started mentioning Daniel's wedding without realizing I knew him personally. The event was becoming one of the biggest social gatherings of the year. Local business leaders planned to attend. Community organizations were involved. Social media posts about the wedding appeared everywhere. And with every new post, I noticed something else. People had started talking about me too. Not directly, not by name. Just small comments that drifted through conversations. Someone had heard I was leading multiple programs across the county. Someone else mentioned seeing an article about our work in the local paper. A parent told another volunteer that I had been recognized by the city council for community outreach. The stories spread quietly. I doubted Daniel paid attention to any of them, but people around him did. I learned that his fiancée had asked questions about me. Nothing inappropriate. Just curiosity. Who was I? What had happened between us? Why had Daniel been married for so long without ever speaking about his ex-wife? Those questions lingered longer than he expected. A mutual acquaintance told me Daniel laughed them off. Ava moved on a long time ago, he reportedly said. She is living a simple life. I just wanted to be polite. Polite. The word almost made me smile. Daniel had spent years protecting his reputation by controlling the narrative around our marriage. If I walked into that ballroom alone, he would control the narrative again. But if I refused to go, he would still win. He would tell people I could not handle seeing him happy. Either way, he expected me to play the role he had written for me. Ethan sat beside me on the porch one evening as the sun disappeared over the water. You do not owe him anything, he said quietly. I know. Then what are you thinking? I looked down at the invitation resting in my lap. For years, I had been afraid of Daniel's opinions. Afraid of his judgment. Afraid of becoming the person he claimed I was. But somewhere along the way, that fear had disappeared. In its place was something stronger. Peace. And peace no longer needed permission. I folded the invitation carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I picked up my phone and typed a short reply. Thank you for the invitation. I will be there. I pressed send without adding another word. The morning of Daniel's wedding arrived with clear skies and the kind of perfect weather people pray for when they want a flawless day. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, smoothing the fabric of my navy dress while reminding myself why I was going. Not for revenge, not for closure, and certainly not for Daniel. I was going because I refused to spend another day hiding from a story that was never mine to carry. For years, I let other people define me by what they believed I lacked. Today, I would define myself. Ethan met me downstairs with the same calm smile that had carried me through some of the hardest years of my life. He did not ask if I was nervous because he already knew I was. Instead, he reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. You do not owe anyone an explanation, he said. I nodded. He was right. The truth did not need my defense. It only needed time. The drive to Ocean Crest Resort felt strangely peaceful. As we turned onto the long driveway lined with white roses and perfectly trimmed hedges, I could already see guests gathering outside the ballroom entrance. Luxury cars filled the circular drive. Valets hurried from vehicle to vehicle. Camera flashes lit up the entrance as local photographers captured arrivals. Daniel had built exactly the kind of wedding he always wanted. Elegant. Expensive. Impossible to ignore. A few guests standing near the entrance recognized me immediately. I saw it in the way their conversations stopped. In the way their eyes widened before they quickly looked away. For years, those reactions would have made me shrink into myself. Not anymore. The car slowed beneath the covered entrance and came to a stop. For one brief moment, everything outside the tinted windows seemed frozen. I glanced beside me at the three little boys sitting quietly, their tiny jackets perfectly straight, their bright eyes filled with excitement instead of fear. They trusted me completely. That trust gave me strength. The driver stepped out first and opened the rear door. The oldest boy climbed out carefully. Then his brothers followed. Three small hands reached for mine at the same time. As we stepped onto the stone driveway together, silence spread across the entrance like a wave. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A woman lowered her champagne glass without taking a sip. Someone dropped a phone. Another guest instinctively reached for theirs to record what they were seeing. I heard whispers ripple through the crowd. Who are those children? Is that Ava? I thought she never had kids. How is that possible? I kept walking, my head high, refusing to look away from the doors ahead. For the first time in years, I felt no shame. Only peace. Inside the ballroom, the string quartet continued playing for several seconds before one musician lost his place. Guests turned toward the entrance one row at a time until nearly every face in the room was staring at us. Daniel stood near the altar beside Olivia, greeting guests with the effortless confidence of a man who believed he controlled every detail of the day. He smiled when he first saw me, the smile he wore whenever he thought he had already won. Then his eyes dropped to the three boys holding my hands. The smile disappeared. He took a step forward as if he had misseen something. His gaze moved from one face to the next. Confusion replaced confidence. Then something else settled into his expression. Uncertainty. I watched him search for an explanation that made sense to him. But there was none. Not yet. One of the boys looked up and smiled politely. Daniel froze. His eyes locked onto the small crescent-shaped dimple on the boy's left cheek. The same dimple I had seen in old family photos hanging in his mother's hallway for years. The color drained from his face. Around us, whispers grew louder. Olivia glanced between Daniel and the boys, her smile fading. Daniel's mother slowly rose from her seat in the front row, staring at the children with wide eyes. She took 2 careful steps toward us, her hand trembling against the back of a chair. Then she looked directly at Daniel and asked the question that silenced the entire ballroom. Daniel, why do those boys look so much like your father? No one moved after Daniel's mother asked her question. The string quartet stopped playing completely. The only sound in the ballroom came from the soft hum of the air conditioning and the nervous whispers spreading through the crowd. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since I had known him, he looked unprepared. Olivia turned toward him slowly, confusion replacing the excitement that had filled her face only moments earlier. Daniel, she asked quietly. He forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to him. It is a coincidence, he said, adjusting his cufflinks with trembling fingers. People imagine connections when they want drama. Nobody laughed with him. His mother kept staring at the boys. Her eyes moved from one face to the next, lingering on familiar features she had seen in family photographs for decades. One of the boys tilted his head the same way Daniel's father always had. Another smiled, revealing the same dimple that had stopped Daniel in his tracks. I felt 3 small hands tighten around mine. They sensed the tension even if they did not understand it. Ethan stepped closer beside us, calm and steady, saying nothing. He did not need to. His presence reminded me how far I had come from the woman who once begged for scraps of affection. Daniel cleared his throat and looked directly at me for the first time. Beneath his forced confidence, I saw something new. Uncertainty. Ava, he said, lowering his voice. Can we talk privately? I met his gaze without flinching. You invited me here publicly. Murmurs swept through the guests. A few people lowered their phones, embarrassed. Others raised them higher. Daniel glanced around the room, suddenly aware that he was no longer controlling the narrative. Olivia stepped forward. Who are these children? She asked. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the fear underneath it. Daniel answered before I could speak. I do not know. The words came too quickly, too defensively. Olivia frowned. Then why do you look like you have seen a ghost? Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Because this is ridiculous. But his eyes kept drifting back to the boys. His mother folded her arms across her chest. You never went to that appointment, did you? She asked quietly. Daniel's head snapped toward her. The color drained from his face again. Around us, conversations stopped completely. Even the guests who knew nothing about our marriage could sense they had stumbled into a truth that had been hidden for years. My heart pounded in my chest. Not from fear. From clarity. I remembered the canceled appointment confirmation email with Daniel's account information attached. I remembered every excuse he gave me. Every time he refused to get tested. Every time he insisted the problem could not possibly involve him. The pieces that never fit together suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Olivia looked between us, her expression growing more serious with every passing second. What appointment? She asked. Daniel avoided her eyes. It was nothing. His mother shook her head slowly. It was not nothing. She looked at me, regret flashing briefly across her face before she turned back to her son. Ava begged you to go with her for years. Daniel's jaw tightened. This is not the time. Then when is the time? She asked. After another woman spends years blaming herself for something she never caused. The room fell silent again. I saw Daniel's confidence slipping away piece by piece. Not because anyone had accused him directly. Not because anyone knew the full truth. But because the questions he had spent years avoiding were finally being asked out loud. Olivia stepped back from him as though seeing him clearly for the first time. Daniel, she said carefully, is there something you have not told me? He looked at her, then at the guests surrounding us, then back at the boys. Panic flickered across his face before he buried it beneath frustration. There is no secret, he insisted. But even he no longer sounded convinced. I reached into my purse and touched the folded copy of the appointment confirmation email I had carried with me all day. I had not planned to use it. Not unless I had to. Olivia followed my movement with her eyes. Her expression changed instantly. What is that? She asked. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Something I should have seen years ago. Olivia turned back to Daniel, her voice no longer uncertain. I want the truth. Right now? All of it. Olivia's question hung in the air. I want the truth. Right now? All of it. Every face in the ballroom turned toward Daniel. He looked trapped for the first time in his life. The man who always had an answer suddenly had none. His eyes moved from me to the boys, then back to the folded papers in my hand. This is not the place for this conversation, he said finally, forcing a tight smile. We can discuss whatever misunderstandings exist later. No, Olivia replied quietly. You invited your ex-wife here. You made this the place. A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. Daniel's mother remained standing beside the front row, her expression filled with confusion and regret. I took a slow breath and looked directly at Olivia. She deserved honesty. So did I. Your fiancé spent years telling people I could not have children, I said calmly. Including me. Daniel's jaw tightened. Ava, stop. I did not. I reached into my purse and removed the documents I had carried with me all day. The first was the appointment confirmation email with both our names listed. The second was a copy of the clinic records I requested after my divorce. For years, I begged Daniel to attend a full fertility evaluation with me. I said. Every appointment was canceled. Every conversation ended the same way. He insisted there was no reason for him to be tested because he believed the problem had to be mine. I handed the printed email to Olivia. Her eyes scanned the page. Her expression changed instantly. The cancellation request had been submitted from Daniel's account less than 12 hours before our joint appointment. She looked up at him in disbelief. You lied to her? Daniel swallowed hard. It is not that simple. I continued before he could take control of the story again. After our divorce, I went to the clinic alone. The doctors found no medical reason I could not have children. Gasps spread through the ballroom. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Daniel's mother lowered her eyes. I looked at the three boys standing quietly beside me, then back at Olivia. The problem was never me. Daniel shook his head immediately. That does not prove anything. But his voice lacked conviction. I held up the second document. When I requested my medical records, I learned something else. Months before our divorce, Daniel completed an individual health screening through his company's insurance provider. His face lost what little color remained. Olivia turned toward him slowly. You told me you had never been tested. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. I continued softly. The clinic records confirmed that he received information he never shared with me. Information that explained why we struggled to have children. The room fell silent. Daniel looked down at the floor as though avoiding everyone's eyes might erase the truth. His mother pressed a hand against her chest. You knew? She whispered. He still said nothing. That silence was answer enough. Olivia stepped back from him. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice remained steady. You let her carry that pain alone for years. Daniel finally looked up at me. For the first time since I had known him, his confidence was gone. There was only fear. Ava, I did not know how to handle it, he said quietly. I thought if I ignored it, things would work out. I shook my head. You did not ignore it. You blamed me. I looked down at the boys again, smiling gently before meeting Olivia's eyes one last time. These children are not a miracle that happened because I finally became worthy. They are proof that I was never broken. Ethan stepped forward and rested a reassuring hand on my shoulder. The boys moved closer to him naturally, without hesitation. No further explanation was necessary. Olivia glanced from Ethan to the children, then back to Daniel. The truth settled over her face all at once. Not just what he had hidden from me, but what he might hide from her someday too. Slowly, she removed her engagement ring. The sound it made as she placed it in Daniel's trembling hand echoed through the silent ballroom. I cannot marry someone who builds his life on another person's pain, she said. Then she turned and walked away. Daniel stared after her, frozen in place as guests stepped aside to let her pass. His perfect wedding, his carefully crafted image, his certainty that he had won, it all collapsed in front of him. He looked back at me with tears gathering in his eyes. Ava, he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time, please, can we talk? Daniel's voice barely rose above a whisper. Ava, please, can we talk? The ballroom remained silent around us. No one reached for a champagne glass. No one returned to their seat. Hundreds of eyes stayed fixed on the man who had spent years controlling every room he entered and the woman he once believed he could erase from his story. I looked at him and saw something I had imagined 1,000 times during the darkest nights after our divorce. Regret. Real regret. Not because he had suddenly become a better person. Not because he finally understood my pain. He regretted losing control. He regretted losing the future he thought belonged to him. He regretted standing alone in front of everyone who once admired him. But most of all, he regretted discovering too late that everything he wanted had been within reach all along. Daniel took a hesitant step toward me. His perfectly tailored tuxedo no longer made him look powerful. It made him look lost. I was scared, he said, his voice shaking. When I got those test results, I could not accept them. I thought if I ignored the problem, it would go away. I held his gaze without speaking. For years, I had rehearsed what I would say if this moment ever came. Now that it had arrived, I realized I did not need to say much at all. The truth had already spoken for me. Daniel swallowed hard. I convinced myself it was easier to blame you than to face what was wrong with me. Around us, guests lowered their eyes. His mother sat down slowly in the front row, tears streaming down her face. She had spent years pressuring me for grandchildren, years believing her son without question. Now she looked at me with the kind of regret that comes when apologies are no longer enough. Olivia had already disappeared through the ballroom doors. The wedding planner quietly instructed staff to stop the music and clear the aisle. Guests began whispering again, but this time their whispers were not about me. They were about Daniel, about the lies, about the canceled appointment, about the years I spent carrying a burden that was never mine. Daniel's phone started vibrating in his pocket. Then it rang. He ignored it. Seconds later, it rang again. One of his business partners stood near the back of the room, avoiding eye contact. Another quietly slipped out the side entrance. The image Daniel had spent years building was cracking apart in real time. He looked at me desperately. I know I cannot change what happened, he said. But please tell me there is something I can do. I glanced down at the 3 boys beside me. They stood close to Ethan, who rested a reassuring hand on the oldest boy's shoulder. Safe, loved, protected. Everything I once begged Daniel to help me build, I had built without him. Not because I was stronger than before, because I finally stopped believing I was broken. Daniel followed my gaze. Tears filled his eyes completely now. I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me, he said. I see that now. For years, those words would have healed something inside me. Today, they changed nothing. The damage had already been done. The lonely nights, the shame, the humiliation, the years I spent questioning my worth. None of it disappeared because he finally admitted the truth. His mother approached slowly, her voice trembling. Ava, I am so sorry. I nodded gently. I appreciated her apology, but it could not return the years I lost trying to earn acceptance I should never have had to earn. Daniel reached toward me, then stopped himself. Even he understood there were boundaries he no longer had the right to cross. "Please," he said one last time, "do not walk away like this." I looked at him for a long moment. The man standing in front of me was not the confident businessman who once believed he had already won. He was a man facing the consequences of his own choices. And for the first time since I stepped into the ballroom, I knew exactly what I wanted to do next. Daniel's voice trembled as he asked me not to walk away, but I no longer felt responsible for saving him from the consequences of his choices. For years, I had carried his fears, his insecurities, and his shame as if they belonged to me. I had apologized for things that were never my fault. I had fought for a marriage he had already abandoned. Standing in that silent ballroom, I finally understood something that would have changed my life years earlier if I had known it then. Love cannot survive where truth is missing. I looked at Daniel one last time. The man in front of me was not the confident businessman who once measured my worth by what I could give him. He was a man facing the reality he spent years avoiding. His wedding was over. His fiancée was gone. The guests who once admired him now whispered behind lowered voices. The business partners who celebrated his success had quietly disappeared. His carefully built image had collapsed in a matter of minutes. Not because I destroyed it, because the truth finally caught up with him. "I am not walking away from you, Daniel," I said calmly. "You walked away from me a long time ago." Tears filled his eyes. He lowered his head as though the weight of those words was finally too heavy to carry. His mother covered her face with her hands. Around us, guests slowly began gathering their belongings and leaving the ballroom. No one looked at me with pity anymore. They looked at me with respect. For the first time in years, I felt seen for who I really was. Not as someone's ex-wife. Not as the woman who could not have children. Just me. I turned toward Ethan. He did not say anything. He simply offered his hand. The same quiet support he had given me from the very beginning. I smiled and took it. The boys immediately reached for us, their small hands finding ours without hesitation. Safe. Loved. Certain of where they belonged. As we walked toward the ballroom doors together, I heard Daniel call my name one last time. I paused for only a moment before looking back. He stood alone beneath the floral arch that had been built for a future that would never happen. His tuxedo was wrinkled. His shoulders were slumped. The man who once believed he had everything finally understood what he had lost. But some losses cannot be repaired. Some apologies arrive too late. I wished him no harm. I wished him no pain. I simply wished him the clarity to live with the truth he spent years running from. Then I turned away. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the stone walkway leading toward the parking area. The boys laughed as they raced ahead, their voices carrying through the ocean breeze. Ethan wrapped an arm around my shoulders, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at peace. Life had not given me the future I imagined when I married Daniel. It had given me something better. It had taught me that my value was never tied to another person's opinion. It had shown me that healing is possible, even after years of pain. And it had led me to people who loved me without conditions. Months later, our mentorship program expanded again. We opened 2 new locations and helped hundreds of families across the county. Parents still stopped me at grocery stores to thank me for believing in their children. Sometimes people recognized me from the wedding. News travels quickly in small communities. They always expected anger when they asked about Daniel. I never gave it to them. Anger had kept me tied to the past for too long. Peace set me free. I heard that Daniel sold the oceanfront house and stepped back from several business partnerships. Some mistakes changed the course of a life forever. His did. But that story no longer belonged to me. Mine continued somewhere else. Mine continued around dinner tables filled with laughter, in classrooms full of hope, and in the small hands that still reached for mine every morning. I was never broken. I was never the problem. And now, finally, everyone knew it.